I was 34 years old, standing in my father's kitchen with a moving box in my arms, when he told me I owed the family everything I had ever earned. He said it the way he said most things, calm, almost bored, like he was reading off a grocery list. Not a raised voice. Not a single flicker of doubt. Just a fact, delivered the way facts are delivered by a man who has never once been asked to prove them. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I did not grow up thinking of myself as a victim. I grew up thinking of myself as the responsible one. The one who paid attention. The one who remembered my mother's blood pressure medication and my father's property tax deadlines and my younger brother Caleb's court dates, because Caleb had a habit of forgetting things like court dates. I was the daughter who showed up. I was the daughter who answered the phone on the second ring, not the fifth. And for 34 years that was enough for me. Showing up felt like love. Felt like belonging. It never once occurred to me that showing up was actually a debt being quietly recorded against my name, one visit, one favor, one wired payment at a time, until the day my father decided to call it due. That day started ordinary. I remember the smell of the kitchen, coffee and something my mother had baked, cinnamon maybe, and the low murmur of a football pregame on the television in the other room. I had driven 2 hours that morning because my parents' water heater had failed and my father, 71 years old and proud of it, had decided he was going to fix it himself and had instead flooded half the basement. I came with towels and a shop vac in my checkbook because that was what I did. I was the fixer. I was the one who fixed things. While I was in the basement, wet up to my knees, my father came down the stairs slowly, one hand on the railing, and stood at the bottom watching me work. He didn't offer to help. He never did. He just watched the way a man watches a horse he trained. Then he said the thing that would end up rearranging the rest of my life. He said, "Rachel, we need to talk about the house. I want to be precise here because precision matters, because for the next several months precision was the only weapon I had." He did not ask me for help. He informed me. He told me that he and my mother had decided, quote, as a family, that I would be taking over the mortgage payments on the house going forward effective immediately, and that this was, in his words, the least I could do considering everything they had done for me over the years. I laughed. I actually laughed, standing in 3 inches of gray water with a shop vac in my hand, because I thought it was a joke, the kind of dry joke my father sometimes made that landed flat because his delivery never changed whether he was serious or not. But he didn't laugh with me. He just looked at me, patient, the way you look at a child who hasn't caught up to an obvious truth yet. He said, "You've always been the one with the good job, Rachel. Caleb has his struggles. Your mother and I are getting older. This is what family does. You owe us that much. You owe us that much." For words that I would replay in my head for the next 11 months, in the shower, in traffic, at 2 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. Not because they hurt, though they did, but because of the certainty behind them. My father said it the way you'd say the sky is blue. Like it was not up for negotiation, like it was not even a request, because a request implies the possibility of no. I asked him what he meant owed. I asked him to explain what exactly I owed and for what. And he told me, standing there dry while I stood there soaked, that they had paid for my college, my braces, my car when I turned 18, my wedding, and that none of that had ever been a gift, that it had always been an investment in the family, and that investments get returned. I want to pause here and tell you something about my brother Caleb, because Caleb matters to this story more than you might expect right now. Caleb was 2 years younger than me. Caleb had also gone to college on my parents' money, had also gotten a car at 18, had also had a wedding paid for, one that ended in divorce 14 months later. Caleb had, at that point in his life, been fired from 4 jobs, had borrowed money from my parents at least 6 times that I knew of, and had never once, not once, been asked to pay any of it back. Caleb was, in my father's language, going through a rough patch. Caleb had always been going through a rough patch. I had simply never noticed that the rough patch had somehow become a permanent address while my own steady, unremarkable competence had quietly become a liability. I didn't argue with my father that day. I want to be honest about that because there's no version of this story where I stood in that basement and delivered some perfect righteous speech. I didn't. I said I needed to think about it. I finished cleaning the basement. I wrote a check for the water heater repair, because old habits die slow and stupid deaths, and I drove home in silence with the radio off, replaying his voice in my head. You owe us that much. My husband, Marcus, was the one who noticed something was wrong before I said a word. He met me at the door and I remember his face changing the moment he looked at mine. Marcus had never loved my parents, not the way I did, not blindly. He'd always had this quiet, careful distance from them, the kind of distance you keep from a stove you've been burned by once. He asked what happened and I told him, and I watched him go very still, the way he does when he's angry but trying not to show it because he knows I need him calm more than I need him furious. He asked me one question that night that changed the direction of everything that followed. He asked, how much have you actually given them over the years? Not estimate. Actually given. Do you have any idea? And I didn't. That was the terrifying part. I had no idea. I had never tracked it, never itemized it, because when you love your parents you don't keep a ledger, you just give the way you breathe without counting. But Marcus wasn't asking me to shame me. He was asking me because he understood something I hadn't let myself understand yet, which was that if my father was going to talk about debts and ledgers and things I owed, then it was time somebody actually opened the books. That was the beginning of the mystery, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. I thought I was just being organized. I went home that weekend and I pulled up my bank statements going back as far as my bank would let me download them, 5 years at first, and then I requested older statements by mail going back almost 12 years. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself I wanted to understand the full picture before I had another conversation with my father. I did not yet understand that I was about to find something that would make the water heater and the mortgage demand feel like a footnote. The first thing I noticed going through those old statements late at night at my kitchen table with Marcus asleep upstairs was a pattern of small transfers, 200 here, 350 there, going out to my parents over the years, sums I remembered giving, help with utility bills, help with Caleb's court fines one particularly bad year, help with a roof repair. Nothing shocking. Nothing I hadn't already known about in some vague, unexamined way. I built a spreadsheet because that is who I am, and I started adding it up, and the number that came back to me was larger than I expected, just over $61,000 across 12 years. Stung, but it didn't shock me. It was the shape of a daughter who loved her family and helped when she could. What shocked me came 3 weeks later. And it came from an unlikely place. My grandmother, my father's mother, a sharp, quiet woman named Eleanor who lived 2 towns over in an assisted living apartment she insisted on paying for herself, called me on a Tuesday evening and asked me to come visit. She said it in a tone I wasn't used to from her, careful, a little urgent, dressed up as casual. I went the next day. Eleanor had never been the warm, cookie-baking kind of grandmother. She'd been a bookkeeper for 40 years before she retired, sharp-eyed, precise, the kind of woman who noticed when a receipt was off by 11 cents. She sat me down at her small kitchen table, made tea neither of us drank, and told me that she had heard, through my mother, about the mortgage conversation. She told me she thought I deserved to know something before I made any decisions. She told me that 15 years earlier, when my grandfather died, he had left a trust, split 3 ways in his will, between my father, my Aunt Denise, and a smaller portion set aside directly for me and Caleb, to be released when we turned 30. She told me this trust had existed. She told me she had seen the paperwork herself, had in fact been one of the witnesses on the original documents, because my grandfather had trusted her judgment more than he trusted anyone else's, including his own sons. I asked her the obvious question. I asked her where that money was because I had never received a cent of any trust when I turned 30 4 years earlier. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something I will never forget. She said, "I don't know, sweetheart, but I know your father was the trustee and I know he never speaks about it, and I think that silence means something." I left Eleanor's apartment that evening with a feeling I can only describe as the floor tilting very slightly under me, not enough to fall, but enough to notice that the room was no longer level. $61,000 in help I'd given willingly suddenly felt small, and almost irrelevant next to the question now sitting in my chest like a stone. What happened to a trust my own grandfather had set aside for me? I need to back up for a moment and tell you what the days between Eleanor's kitchen table and my own kitchen table actually felt like, because I don't want you to think this realization arrived neatly in one clean piece. It didn't. It arrived in fragments, the way bad news usually does, a little at a time, each fragment small enough to almost explain away on its own. The first fragment was a memory I hadn't thought about in years, resurfacing uninvited while I was driving home from Eleanor's apartment. I remembered being 29, a year before my supposed trust distribution, sitting at my parents' dinner table while my father talked, almost in passing, about updating some paperwork with his lawyer. I remembered asking, half joking, if it had anything to do with me, And I remembered him laughing and saying, "Don't worry about it, it's boring adult stuff." At the time I'd taken that as a brush off, the kind of thing parents say to keep their children out of grown-up business. Driving home from Eleanor's replaying it, I understood it differently. He had been talking about the trust. He had been standing right at the edge of telling me the truth, and he had chosen deliberately not to. The second fragment came a few days later, when I mentioned to my mother carefully, almost as a throwaway comment, that I'd been thinking about Grandpa lately, missing him. My mother's face did something strange in that moment, a flicker of something she smoothed over so quickly I almost missed it, and she changed the subject to something about her garden. I didn't understand that flicker then. I understood it much later, once I knew what she may or may not have known. Once I understood that my mother had spent years living inside a marriage built on omissions she may not have even fully recognized as omissions. I want to be honest that during this period I doubted myself constantly. I would sit at my kitchen table at 11 at night with my spreadsheet open and think, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's an explanation, maybe Grandpa changed his mind before he died and nobody told me because it seemed unimportant. I gave my father that grace over and over in the privacy of my own head, long before I ever gave him the chance to explain himself out loud. I think that's something people don't talk about enough, how much invisible, unpaid emotional labor goes into simply allowing yourself to suspect someone you love of wrongdoing. It is exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with proof or evidence. It's exhausting because some part of you is grieving the version of the person you thought you knew, even before you've confirmed that version was ever real. I didn't confront my father right away. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. I had spent 34 years being the daughter who trusted, who assumed good faith, who filled in the gaps in her family's story with the most generous possible explanation. That instinct doesn't die in one conversation with a grandmother over lukewarm tea. Some small, stubborn part of me still wanted there to be an explanation. Maybe the trust had been used for something legitimate. Maybe there was a piece of paper somewhere with my signature on it that I simply didn't remember signing. I needed to know before I accused anyone of anything, because I had grown up in a house where accusations without proof were treated as betrayals worse than the original sin itself. So I did what I do. I started digging quietly, carefully, the way you defuse something rather than detonate it. I requested a copy of my grandfather's will from the county records office, which, as public probate record, I was entitled to see. It took 9 days to arrive. When it did, I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice, then a third time, my hands not quite steady. The will confirmed everything Eleanor had told me. A trust of $140,000, split between 2 grandchildren, myself and Caleb, $70,000 each, to be distributed upon each grandchild's 30th birthday, administered until then by my father as trustee. My 30th birthday had come and gone 4 years earlier. I had never seen a dollar of it. I had never even heard the word trust spoken in my parents' house. Not once, not at a holiday dinner, not at a birthday, not during any of the countless conversations about money that had defined so much of my relationship with my father. I called Caleb, careful, casual, testing the water. I asked him, almost offhand, if he remembered anything about a trust from Grandpa. My brother, who forgets court dates and job start times and his own anniversary, did not forget this. He told me with a strange flatness in his voice that yes, he'd gotten some money when he turned 30, that Dad had called it a gift, helped him with a down payment on a condo that Caleb had ended up losing 18 months later after he stopped making payments. I asked him how much. He said around $70,000. $70,000 had gone to Caleb, dressed up as a gift from our father's own generosity, and no discernible cent had gone to me. My father hadn't just delayed my inheritance. He had apparently redirected mine or spent it, or done something with it that had left me with nothing, while telling me 3 weeks after I discovered this, that I owed the family everything I had. I felt something in me go very quiet and very cold that night. And I want to be clear that quiet and cold is not the same as reckless. I did not call my father screaming. I did not drive to his house. I sat at my kitchen table with Marcus across from me, and I told him everything: the will, the trust, Caleb's condo, the $61,000 I'd already given without being asked, the mortgage demand that had started this whole unraveling. And Marcus, who is a quiet man but not a passive one, said the words that shaped the next 4 months of my life. He said, "Rachel, you're not going to win this by being hurt. You're going to win this with paper. Get the paper." So I got the paper. I want to walk you through what that actually looked like because I think there's a fantasy people have about confronting a parent, that it happens in one dramatic scene, a single conversation where the truth explodes and everyone reacts the way they would in a movie. That is not what happened. What happened was quiet, patient, methodical work spread across 4 months, the kind of work that doesn't feel like revenge while you're doing it. Feels like homework. It feels like being very, very tired. I started with the county clerk's office again, requesting any documents related to the trust's administration, which as a named beneficiary I had a legal right to request. That took time in 2 separate visits because the first clerk told me I needed a specific form that the second clerk told me I didn't actually need at all. Eventually I received a folder of documents including something I hadn't expected, an accounting statement my father had been legally required to file annually as trustee, disclosing how the trust funds were being managed. He had filed exactly 2 of these statements in the first 2 years after my grandfather's death and then nothing. Not one filing in the following 13 years. That silence, I would later learn from a lawyer, was itself a red flag serious enough to warrant investigation on its own. I hired that lawyer in the 5th week of what I had started privately calling, in my own head, the discovery. Her name was Patricia and Delgado, a trust and estate attorney recommended by a coworker who had gone through something similar with her own family, though nowhere near this scale. Patricia was in her 50s, unhurried, the kind of woman who took notes in careful, tiny handwriting and never once raised her voice, not because she lacked feeling but because she had learned the way I was learning that calm was its own kind of power. She read through what I'd gathered and told me something that both terrified me and settled something in my chest. She said, "This isn't a family disagreement, Rachel. This is a breach of fiduciary duty. Possibly worse. But I want more paper before we do anything. Paper doesn't lie. People do. So we got more paper." Patricia helped me file a formal request through her office for a full accounting of the trust, which as trustee my father was legally obligated to provide upon request from a beneficiary. He had 30 days to respond. He did not respond in 30 days. He responded in 52, and only after Patricia sent a second, sharper letter referencing specific statutes. When his response finally came, it was 3 pages of vague language and round numbers, no bank statements, no transaction records, just his signature at the bottom claiming the funds had been used for, quote, family expenses and my education and general welfare over the years. I remember reading that letter at my kitchen table, and feeling something shift in me permanently. Because I had, in fact, paid for my own education, working 2 jobs through college specifically because my parents had told me at 17 that they couldn't help with tuition, that money was tight. I had taken out loans I was still paying off at 34. And here was my father, in writing, claiming that trust money meant for me had somehow been spent on my education that I had, in reality, paid for entirely myself. Patricia said this was good. Not good for my family, obviously, but good for the case because a vague, unsubstantiated claim in writing was worth more to us than silence. She subpoenaed the trust's associated bank records, a process that took another 6 weeks of waiting that felt endless, filled with ordinary life happening around this enormous unresolved thing. Birthday parties, work deadlines, my son's school play, all of it happening while somewhere in a bank's records department, the true history of my missing inheritance sat waiting to be printed out and mailed to a law office. The records arrived on a Thursday. Patricia called me that evening, her voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard from her before, something between vindication and disgust. She told me to come to her office the next morning, that I needed to see this in person. I remember that meeting with a clarity most memories don't have. Patricia had laid the statements out across her conference table, years of them, highlighted, tabbed, organized with small yellow sticky notes marking specific transactions. She walked me through it slowly. The trust had originally been funded with $140,000, invested conservatively, growing over 13 years to roughly $168,000 by the time it should have been distributed. $70,000 had gone to Caleb, disguised as my father's personal gift for the condo down payment, meaning my father had simply pulled Caleb's share out and relabeled it, technically not illegal on its own if done with proper accounting, though the lack of any accounting made it deeply questionable. My share, my $70,000 plus its portion of growth, closer to $84,000 by that point, had not gone to me at all. It had gone, in a series of transfers over 9 years, into an account my father controlled, and from there into a mix of things. A boat purchased 6 years earlier, that I remembered my father proudly showing off at a family barbecue, telling everyone he'd, quote, finally treated himself after years of hard work. A significant chunk toward a kitchen renovation at my parents' house that I remembered complimenting, genuinely, thinking my father had been saving carefully for it. And nearly $30,000 spread across 4 years, transferred to an account belonging to a woman named Sharon Whitfield, a name I did not recognize at all. I asked Patricia who Sharon Whitfield was. She said she didn't know yet, but that we could find out, and something in the careful, neutral way she said it told me she already suspected something I wasn't ready to hear. It took another 2 weeks to learn the truth about Sharon Whitfield, and I'll tell you now because there's no elegant way to delay it. She was a woman my father had been seeing quietly for the better part of 5 years, a relationship that had apparently started while my mother was recovering from a serious surgery and had, according to what we eventually pieced together, continued in the years since. He had been using my trust money in part to fund an apartment Sharon lived in, an apartment listed under a name I would later learn was Sharon's own maiden name, deliberately obscured. I want to tell you honestly that this part of the discovery didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief, a strange, disorienting grief for a version of my father I had spent my whole life believing existed. A stern but fundamentally honest man. Difficult but not dishonest. That man, it turned out, had never really existed, or had existed only partly, alongside another version of himself capable of taking his own granddaughter's inheritance and using it to fund a secret life while simultaneously telling that same granddaughter she owed the family everything she had. I didn't confront him immediately. Even with all of this in hand, Patricia counseled patience, one final piece of documentation she wanted before we moved forward, a formal demand letter that would give my father one last chance to respond honestly before we escalated to a legal claim for breach of fiduciary duty, an action that could have resulted not just in the return of my funds but in significant additional penalties, and depending on how deliberate a court found the concealment, potential referral for further investigation. She sent that letter on a Monday. It requested a meeting. My father asked that the meeting happen at my parents' house, which felt in hindsight like exactly the kind of home field advantage he'd always relied on, the kitchen table where all our family conversations happened, where I had once stood in floodwater agreeing without agreeing to take on his mortgage. I brought Patricia. I brought a folder. I did not bring anger, not visibly, because by that point I had done the work of moving through anger and out the other side into something steadier, something closer to resolve. My mother was there too, and I want to say something about her because she is not a villain in this story, not exactly. She sat at that table with the particular stillness of a woman who has spent decades not asking questions she was afraid of the answers to. I don't think she knew about Sharon Whitfield. I watched her face when Patricia laid out that name and that address, and I have never seen an expression collapse so completely and so silently in my life. Whatever else happened that day, that moment is the one I still think about most. I remember small physical details from that meeting with a strange, almost useless clarity, the kind of detail your mind holds onto because it doesn't know yet what will matter and what won't. There was a plate of cookies on the table that no one touched, the same cinnamon smell I remembered from the day of the flooded basement, as if my mother had baked them out of pure habit, muscle memory reaching for normalcy in a moment that had none left to offer. My father's hands were folded in front of him on the table very still, the way they always were when he wanted to project calm control, and I remember thinking watching those still hands, that I had spent my whole life reading that stillness as strength, and only now understood it might have simply been practice. My father, for his part, tried denial first. He said the boat had been paid for with his own savings. He said the renovation had been a joint decision with my mother, using their own money. Patricia, in her calm, unhurried voice, simply slid the highlighted bank statements across the table, one by one transaction dates lined up next to trust account withdrawals, the same amounts, the same days, sometimes the same hour. My father is not a stupid man. He looked at those papers for a long time, and I watched something in his face change, the particular shift of a man who has just realized the story he's been telling himself for years is no longer available to him, because the paper doesn't care what story he wants to tell. He tried anger next, briefly, told me I had no right coming into his home with a lawyer, that this was a family matter. And I said the only thing I'd planned to say that entire meeting, the one line I'd rehearsed in the car on the way over. I said, "You told me I owed this family everything I have. I just wanted to see the math on that. And it turns out I don't owe anyone anything. It turns out you owe me $84,000, plus interest, plus whatever a judge decides a boat and an apartment for Sharon Whitfield are worth. I did not raise my voice saying it. I want that understood clearly because the entire story of that day, and honestly the entire arc of those 4 months, was about the power of not raising my voice, of letting the paper do the shouting I refused to do myself. What happened after that wasn't a dramatic courtroom scene, and I think that surprises people when I tell this story because we've all been trained by movies to expect a trial, a verdict, a gavel. What actually happened was quieter and, in its own way, more satisfying. Facing the certainty of a losing case, the exposure of an affair he'd hidden from my mother for years, and the very real possibility of a court referral given the pattern of concealment, my father agreed to a settlement negotiated through Patricia's office. He would repay the full trust amount, $84,000, with interest calculated back to my 30th birthday, structured as payments over 18 months, secured against the equity in the house he had once demanded I take over the mortgage for. The kitchen renovation he'd funded with my money would, in effect, be the collateral guaranteeing I got that money back. My parents separated 4 months after that meeting. Not because of the money, or not only because of the money, but because my mother, once she knew about Sharon Whitfield, found a version of courage I don't think even she knew she had. She filed for divorce herself, quietly, without drama, in a way that felt, to me, like an echo of what I'd just done. She moved into a small apartment near my grandmother, and the two of them, mother-in-law and daughter-in-law who had never been particularly close, became something like allies in the aftermath, 2 women who had spent decades being patient with a man who had never once been asked to account for himself. Caleb, for his part, struggled to understand any of it for a long time. He felt caught in the middle, and there were a few hard months where he barely spoke to me. Some tangled mix of guilt over the condo money and defensiveness toward our father that I understood even as it hurt. But eventually, slowly, he came around, in the way people do when enough time passes for anger to soften into something more honest. He apologized, not for anything he'd done deliberately, but for never asking the questions I'd been forced to ask. We're closer now than we were before any of this happened, strange as that sounds. I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with my father before things settled into whatever new careful shape they're going to hold going forward, because I think it's the part of this story people remember longest. It was months later, after the settlement had been signed, after the first 2 payments had already come through. He called me out of nowhere on a Sunday evening. He didn't apologize, not really, not in the way I might have imagined wanting years earlier. What he said instead was that he hadn't expected me to, quote, go that far. He said it almost like an accusation, like the digging itself was the betrayal rather than the thing the digging had uncovered. I told him something I'd been turning over in my head for weeks by that point, something that had finally settled into words. I told him I hadn't gone looking for a fight. I'd gone looking for the truth because he told me I owed him everything, and I simply wanted to know what everything actually meant. It turned out everything meant a boat, and an apartment for a woman I'd never met, and 13 years of silence where an accounting should have been. I told him I didn't feel triumphant about any of it. I felt tired and a little sad, and mostly just relieved that I finally knew the truth instead of living inside a story that had never been true at all. He didn't have much to say to that. We talked a little longer stiffly about nothing important, and then we hung up, and that was more or less the last real conversation of substance we've had. We speak sometimes now, careful, distant, the way 2 people speak when a great deal has broken and only some of it can be repaired. I don't know if it will ever be more than that, and I've made a kind of peace with the possibility that it won't. What I do know is this. I used part of that repaid money, the first year's worth of payments, to finally pay off the last of my own student loans, the ones I'd taken out because my parents told me at 17 there was no money for my education, while at the same time apparently, there had been a trust worth $140,000 sitting with my name attached to it. There is a particular quiet satisfaction in signing the final loan payoff form, watching a balance that had followed me for 16 years finally drop to zero, funded in the end by the very money that had been kept from me all along. It felt less like revenge and more like a debt finally honestly settled, on the correct side of the ledger for the first time in my life. I think about that day in the flooded basement often, my father standing dry at the bottom of the stairs telling me I owed the family everything I had, while I stood in 3 inches of water holding a shop vac and my checkbook. I think about how certain he sounded, how absolute, how he never once considered that someone might actually ask him to show his work. I think about how close I came to simply agreeing, to taking on that mortgage the way I'd taken on everything else for 34 years without question because questioning felt back then like a kind of disloyalty. I don't think that anymore. I think now that love without honesty isn't really love. It's just a story one person tells while the other person quietly pays for it. I think the bravest thing I ever did wasn't the confrontation at that kitchen table, or the lawyer or the subpoenaed bank records. I think the bravest thing I did was the small, unremarkable moment weeks earlier when I sat down at my own kitchen table, opened my laptop, and simply asked to see the numbers. Because it turns out that's all it ever takes, in the end, to unravel a lie that's been allowed to stand unquestioned for years. Not anger. Not a confrontation. Just paper and patience and the willingness to finally ask the question you'd spent your whole life too afraid or too loyal to ask out loud. There's one more image I want to leave you with because I think it says more than any summary I could give you. A few weeks after the settlement was signed, I drove out to see my grandmother Eleanor, the woman whose careful, quiet phone call had started all of this. I brought her flowers, which she waved off as unnecessary in the exact tone I now recognized as her way of being moved by something without having to say so directly. We sat at her small kitchen table again, the same one where she'd first told me about the trust, and this time I was the one with the folder, laying out for her, page by page, everything the paperwork had ultimately uncovered. She listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when I finished she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, her skin thin and cool and steady. She told me that my grandfather, her husband, had set up that trust specifically for me and Caleb because he'd worried even back then that fairness in that family was never going to be automatic, that it would have to be built by someone with the patience to insist on it. She said she hadn't known exactly what had happened to the money, only that something had felt wrong for years, a silence where an accounting should have been, and that she'd finally decided I was the only person in the family with the temperament to actually find out. I asked her why she'd waited so long to say anything. She said something I've carried with me since, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you keep meaning to skip across water but can't quite bring yourself to throw. She said, I didn't want to hand you an accusation, Rachel. Accusations just make people defensive. I wanted to hand you a question, because questions are the only thing strong enough to survive a family that doesn't want to answer them. I think about that a lot now, the difference between an accusation and a question. My father had spent my whole life handing me conclusions dressed up as facts. You owe us that much, this is what family does, and expecting me to accept them the way you accept weather without inspection, without proof. What finally broke that pattern wasn't anger. It was the simple, stubborn decision to ask instead of accept, to request the statement instead of the story, to let the numbers speak in a voice steadier and far more convincing than any argument I could have shouted across that kitchen table. My son is 7 now, and someday when he's older, I'll tell him this story, not as a warning about his grandfather specifically, but as something more useful than that. I'll tell him that love is supposed to be able to survive scrutiny, that anyone who tells you scrutiny itself is the betrayal is usually the one with something to hide from it. I'll tell him that the quietest, calmest question you ever ask can turn out to be the loudest thing you ever say. And I'll tell him that I hope he never has to learn that lesson the way I did. Standing in a flooded basement at 34 years old, being told he owed the world everything he had, before a single bank statement finally proved that he didn't owe anyone anything at all. I don't owe anyone a story about how grateful I should be. I never did. And these days that's a debt I've stopped paying entirely.